Eliza, it's great to have you back. And I don't even know how many times you've been on. You've been on so many times, I don't remember anymore. So how you doing?
Maybe we should call this the Jay and Eliza show or something.
That'll be good. I have to brand that though. That's a lot of work. So what's been going on? Probably been about 9 months or so since last time we've had a chat. Anything going on in your world exciting?
Well, yeah, I mean, we've been doing a lot of the post-COVID care, which is, I think most people are feeling that everybody, the other side of COVID decided they needed to work on the things that came out during COVID. And so been very busy with that. But yeah, also doing some more writing and working on some resources for parents of teens on the subject of anxiety. And I was just sharing with you offline, got a children's book coming out as well. So that's been keeping me busy.
That's great. Is it time to talk about your children's book, or do we need to wait until it's closer to
Oh
launch
no,
to
we can talk about
it?
it. I am so excited because I got the cover of it today. I got the cover graphic, and yeah, it's fun to see. This is my first children's book, so.
Do you have that cover there for those? Some of these are going to look on YouTube. And
Oh
this is the
yes,
exciting world
if
of
you
pictures in
can
here.
see this, if you're watching, you can see the cover,
Oh
and
my
who
gosh.
knows,
If
you
you're
might be
listening to this, you are missing out right now. So that's really cute. Really cute. What
yeah.
did it
So
say? Count yourself calm?
count yourself calm. It's a emotion regulation exercise turned into a little children's storybook. So helps them calm their emotions. And the subtitle says, "Taking big feelings to a big God."
Oh, wow. Hey, we need to pause just a second. Okay. Hold on a
Yep.
minute. Okay, there's going to be some kind of weird transition right here for the strangest text message that's ever interrupted a podcast. I got one saying, "Can you come over? So and so just cut themselves with a machete." So I normally can really ignore messages.
Not that
He's
one.
okay. Yes. I was looking for decapitation, and he's okay, but he was a little lightheaded, I think. So. Weird transition, Elijah, because
That
our
is
topic
weird.
today
Yes,
turns out,
exactly.
yeah, it's so strange because our topic today, we actually are going to be talking about cutting, and
It's
that is the
bizarre.
strangest segue into a very serious conversation that I've ever had. At the end, remind me, I do want to talk about you have another book, but
Sure.
yeah, cutting, but not the machete kind.
No, we don't.
We're going to talk about today. That is really weird. Sorry, that kind of rattled me a little bit, but thank God he's okay. Yes. So sorry, I just had to collect myself a minute. Eliza, the practice of cutting is something that has been around for some time, and it seems like it kind of ebbs and flows, at least from my perspective, as far as popularity with young people. I don't really know so much with older people. And I also don't know, like, is there a more technical name for it, or is it just kind of known by cutting?
Oh, that's a really good question. I mean, yeah, so most people refer to it as cutting or self-harm or self-injury. The actual clinical name is non-suicidal self-injury. So it goes by the letters NSSI. And that is actually a very important label or title for it, because I think, and we're going to talk a little bit more about some of the misconceptions or the myths of cutting, but yeah, we think of cutting and we can kind of get alarmed, even like you know, we talked about earlier, just kind of those kind of things can alarm us when somebody's been injured. But specifically with cutting, I have found, and I just recently was talking with a church who wanted me to kind of help them think through some of their policies of when do they get help for people. And they did what a lot of people do. They included suicide and cutting in like the same level of concern. And it's important that, you know, that's why NSSI is actually helpful, because it's non-suicidal self-injury, which means most of the time, people who are cutting, people who are self-harming or engaging in self-injury aren't suicidal. Now, what I will say to that is it's certainly a very concerning situation, because whenever somebody is cutting, intentionally and recutting, the risk of infection goes way up. So it's not like, oh, it's no big deal, it's just a cut or whatever. Like it is actually, there's some reasons to be concerned. And there is a certain amount of comorbidity with other mental health issues at times with people who are engaging pretty regularly, especially children with cutting. And so that's an important thing to mention because that's the clinical name, but it also helps us kind of emphasize that this is not a suicidal act, if you will, or a potential suicidal attempt, I meant to say.
Is it appropriate to say that this would be in the realm somewhere like anorexia or bulimia, where like it's serious, and it can get very bad, but it's not typically like immediately a fatal kind of thing? Or is this a completely different pathway and completely different realm than that? Because I guess my thought process would be these are different pathways of escape, of control, of like life is out of order and I'm trying to do something to control one little piece of my life.
So yeah,
they're just completely, that's kind of my mentality about it. But I know far less about cutting and why people get into it than I do any of the others.
Well, I do think that there is a connection there that's worth mentioning. You mentioned eating disorders and cutting. And what I would say to that is eating disorders are a type of self-harm. They are self-harm. Now, eating disorders, I think, are in a different category than even just like suicidal ideation and suicidal attempts are in a different category than self-harm, in that eating disorders are one of the most lethal mental health issues that kids face. And so this is, you're putting that, I mean, that's like a high risk category. But as I mentioned, there's some comorbidity where if a person is cutting, the chances of them having an eating disorder is a little bit higher, like they fall into that category. But I don't want to alarm parents. I don't want parents to think like, oh my goodness, I found my child cutting or scratching or burning or whatever. And we'll talk about the different methods that kids use, but and therefore that equals. It doesn't. But there can be some connection points. But I would say if you have reason to believe your child has an eating disorder, they're in a much higher risk category than cutting. That isn't to say that cutting isn't important. It's very important. But I almost feel like it might be helpful then, since we kind of already kind of started thinking around what does this look like? Because you're actually talking parents' language. Like how do I think about this?
Yeah.
Maybe
like, do I panic? Do I panic immediately? Do I need to immediately remove every sharp object from my house? Should my child go to a treatment center? What have I done? You know,
yes.
How did I mess up? I mean, there's all kinds of things that go into this. Who's influencing them? Where are they coming from? But I think even just first off, big picture, like what's going on? Typically, obviously every situation is different, but
sure. Yeah, it is. But I think there's certain things that can be helpful for parents. And I'll just give you a definition that I like. It actually comes from a guy. His name is Dr. Mark Mayfield. I don't know if you know who he is, but he's written something called, it's a book called Help My Teen is Self-Injuring. And he wrote that for Focus on the Family, which means, listen up, parents, it's free and available online. So you can just Google Help My Teen is Self-Injuring. It's Dr. Mark Mayfield. And I like that book because he is a believer, though it's not highly, it doesn't have a whole lot of biblical content. It does have some direction. Each chapter kind of gives you some direction on how to think about this from a faith perspective. Okay. But I like his definition. So I'll share with you his definition. He says self-injury is a deliberate and intentional, self-induced, non-lethal act of bodily harm, which is done to, and this is what we're getting at, it's done to reduce, avoid, and communicate mental, emotional, physical, or spiritual distress. So that's kind of, I think that's a good definition to kind of get parents to understand, but it also leads to the why, which is what parents want to know right away. Like, why are you doing this? And that's where you see there that there is a desire to have emotions, whether the emotional distress or a physical distress, or I would even say like social distress that comes from, a lot of times kids who are cutting are experiencing a lot of social challenges, bullying, just hard social dynamics, and definitely the phones, social media does not help, because not only is that a place where kids can get more pressure and feeling like they don't measure up and hurt brought into their world, but they can also learn a whole lot about cutting. Kids will put that out there on social media. So that's the picture of it. Why they do it is some of those things there. I think there's a few other reasons why kids do it. So Mark Mayfield mentioned here that it is to reduce or avoid the distress. So that's really important. I think that's a big part of why kids will often start cutting, is they're trying to manage certain stress, certain emotional distress, or even spiritual distress. And they don't know how. So I know you and I have talked before about the reality that kids' brains develop different, or they develop the same, but they develop at a different rate. There's just not like your child is born and their brains, we all know, I think it's around 25. I actually heard a later number just recently. I haven't done any research to see if it's even later, but around 25, right, is when people say.
Definitely not younger. I can tell you that. Definitely not younger.
Yeah. So if kids' brains don't develop fully until 25, what is happening? Well, their brains develop from the back to the front. So they start with the emotional, their brains develop in the emotional part of their brain. So they have a lot of emotions, but they don't have that prefrontal cortex to kind of help them make sense of that. And so you see this distress. And on top of that, that emotional part of the brain that they are, that's developed earlier, also is kind of the risk center of the brain. So it puts kids in a place where they're willing to take risks. And there's actually some really in my opinion, like God designed reasons why that is the case, but they're willing to take risks and they don't have that logical thinking yet developed. So they end up doing things that are unhelpful for them when their emotions feel too big. And that's what we see oftentimes, not every time, but oftentimes when kids are doing this, is there's some kind of, they're looking to reduce or avoid or even communicate these strong emotions that they have.
So they're feeling something that's bigger than what they can handle. And by inflicting a small amount of physical pain on themselves, it's like a distraction and a little dopamine release from the emotion. So like there's first off, there's something to focus my attention on when I do it, but also there's some kind of, I guess it's it's part of your immune system or whatever that's going on to protect you when you get cut and scratched in other places. But like, so there's some kind of pleasure feeling that they're getting, as well as a distraction from whatever hard thing that they can't manage. Is that accurate?
Yeah, there's something called the pain offset relief, and it's something that happens to us when it really basically whenever the removal of pain happens in our life, we feel a little bit better. So I have a headache, I'm feeling pretty bad about my situation. I take some acetaminophen or something, and then half an hour later, I'm actually feeling a little bit better. There's something about relieving pain, obviously, that makes us feel better. And so if that's the case, the thing that cutting can do, this is just an interesting dynamic. It can not only distract, like you said, but it can create a scenario where they now have to, they now can like attend to. And I've actually heard some people, I told you offline that I see this not just in children, but in adults as well. And one of the things that I've heard from an adult is that there's something about attending to the wound and seeing it get better that is rewarding. And I think it's that pain relief or pain offset relief that helps us go, okay, the removal of pain actually gives us, like you said, maybe pleasure or satisfaction that we're not getting because the emotional pain isn't going away. So it's sort of like, I can't get rid of this pain, but I can through the injury, I can actually see pain going away as it
Interesting.
heals and
Huh.
so forth. So there's a lot, it's so complex. There's so many things. And that's why, you know, offline, I was telling you, like, there's no way we can fit everything into one podcast, but at least we can get parents thinking along the lines of what's going on. Another thing that happens with kids is that they can do it to punish. So if they have a sense of maybe they really messed up, or they're not good enough, or they're feeling a lot of comparison and they just don't feel like they measure up, it can be a way of like self-punishment as well,
Mm-hmm.
which is another reason why kids will sometimes do it.
So is this something that is gaining in popularity, or does it kind of stay steady? It feels like I'll go times without hearing about it, and then all of a sudden I'll come across like clusters, and not necessarily like I would understand if it's clusters of friends,
Mm-hmm.
which I think there's probably definitely a social dynamic. It seems like with every destructive behavior, there's some kind of social dynamic where,
Yeah.
like if you're aware of people doing it, you're much more likely to do it.
Yeah.
But does this ebb and flow, or is it pretty steady state that there seems to always be a certain percentage of young people that are wrestling with this?
No, I think it's growing for sure, and I do think social media is, and YouTube for sure, is one of the reasons why it is growing, because like I mentioned earlier, kids have access to learn how to do it and how
Mm-hmm.
to hide it, because that's a big part of it as well. The other thing is, honestly, Jay, we just don't have a ton of research on it. There is research that is happening and growing, but we just don't have a lot of research on it yet to know, like, is this a new phenomenon? Is this going to stick around? Is it getting worse? There are definitely a lot of people in the mental health field who are watching it and doing research to try to see like what's going on with this, because it is something that it's concerning. It's very
Mm-hmm.
concerning for parents when they do find out. And sometimes by the time parents find out, it's been going on for a while.
Yeah, yeah. Let's start with signs. Like for
Yeah.
a parent, um, well, maybe a couple things. First off, like not every parent in the world necessarily needs to be suspicious that their child is cutting, but
Yeah.
also, you know, what are some just warning or trigger signs of you should be on the lookout for these things, because these tend to be ways that children operate if they're involved in cutting, or the way that they tend to hide it. Because
Yeah.
you know, I'm sure sweatshirts, but like it's got to be more than just I wear long sleeves.
Yeah, I mean that's an obvious one, and that's a good one. Is to recognize, like, even in hot weather, is my child wearing long sleeves and long
Mm-hmm.
pants, and really things like you know, and this can be tricky because of the age group that kids tend to start cutting in. These things are normal for them to start doing, which is like things like they don't want to have mom or dad see them changing or anything like that, and that's kind of normal for that
Right.
age group.
Yeah.
But it's just something you want to kind of keep aware of. But you do want to be looking for, if you have suspicions, you want to be looking for things like certainly like you, scars or marks or even fresh wounds that they don't really have a good reason why they're there, or they say they
Mm-hmm.
can't remember. There's just no real good reasoning for it, and there's really, you're seeing that show up. But you also want to look for blood on certain clothing items, and you may not be able to see their skin if they're hiding from you, but you might still be doing their laundry and looking for
Okay.
those kind of things on clothes that touch their skin. If there's, you know, little blood marks, or even things in their trash that would potentially be used for cutting, things that have
Okay.
sharp edges, that, and if there's any blood in the trash as well. So you're looking for those kind of things, but you're not just looking for, we often think like sharp razor blade type things. You're looking for scratching. That's for younger kids, believe it or not. Sadly, this is affecting younger and younger kids. You want to look for scratching. That's a very common one, as well as like bruises or rubbing to the point where like I don't want to give too many details, but like using maybe an eraser or something to rub on their hand really hard, or wherever they are going to leave the mark. Things like that. Those are certainly physical signs, but you also want to look for things like, are they pulling out their hair? Bruises that might be there as well. So, yeah, a lot of physical signs that, like we started at the beginning, are going to be hidden as much as possible.
And it tends to be arms and upper legs. Is that
Those
accurate?
are sure, but I mean, I've had people cut their abdomens, like their stomach area as
Mm-hmm.
well. Any place that's not going to be super visible all the
Okay.
time. Yeah. So certainly that's a physical sign. You
Mm-hmm.
also want to just look for other signs. Emotional signs are a big one. If you're worried about your child, it's going to be important to kind of lean into that and ask them some good questions. But if you're starting to see like them just be kind of self-loathing or just feeling kind of worthless, you just notice that they kind of have a bad self-image. And again, it's hard because you're talking about kids in like puberty age where this
Mm-hmm.
kind of comes with the
Yeah.
territory.
Yeah. Every
So,
kid hates the way they look at some point or another, or hates
mhm,
something about themselves. But yeah, so we have those, like, that's the thing, is obviously every child is not going to start cutting when they hate themselves, but there's a good chance that at some point in your parenting journey with each child, they're going to fall into some kind of destructive behavior. And so if you just have some kind of general understanding of the signs to look for each of these, then you can dive deeper if you need to in a particular one. Um, so that's signs. Now let's say there's a discovery. Um,
mhm.
and so as a parent, what do I do? And let's talk internally first, not, and then we'll talk about my reaction and the follow up with my child. But like internally, I've just discovered that my child is cutting, and I'm in shock, and I have 1,000 questions in my head, and I'm trying not to
Yeah.
panic, but I'm a little bit panicky. Um, what would you speak to that parent?
Yeah. I mean, and I understand that like it's scary to find this information out. That's usually how it's going to happen, is you're going to find it out. But I think in some ways, like our kids need us in that situation to take care of ourselves and to make sure
Mm-hmm.
we're in a place to respond to them well. Because a couple things you don't want to do is ask them why, because they probably don't know why. And if they do know why, they certainly don't have the words to articulate it well. Otherwise, they would be processing out those emotions
Mm-hmm.
and not
Huh.
cutting. So you don't want to necessarily jump there, but I think so taking care of yourself first. And one of the ways that I would say first and foremost is make sure you give yourself some space to pray about this, asking the Lord for wisdom, because there isn't just an easy, here's 3 steps you do when your child is self-harming. That's just not there. But pray, ask the Lord for wisdom, ask the Lord to help you know how to navigate this. There's 3 things that I feel like parents do wrong, and I won't just harp there because I don't want parents to feel bad about these things, because every parent does them. But there's 3 things that parents do wrong in situations like this or other places in parenting. One is they talk too much. They
Hmm.
come in with all the reasons why this is unhealthy and dangerous and they shouldn't do it. And they talk too much and they just come in with the lecture, if you will. So some parents will come in that way. Other parents will come in with too much emotion. They just come in very upset. And this is why I said, take some time to get with the Lord, but because you can come in with a whole lot of emotion and that can just be overwhelming and kind of like, no, this is why I was hiding this from you. The children can be thinking. But the other thing that parents can do is they can decide the best thing to do is to do nothing. And we just won't talk about it, or we just hope I'll just watch it and see. And all 3 of those are not helpful in this kind of a situation. So pray for sure. But the other thing I would say is lean into community and talk with other safe parents. Your pastor, a counselor can be very helpful if you are not sure how to talk to your kids about this. Talk to a counselor who can kind of help you navigate what that could look like. But I think, as we see this, we have to see this as, yes, it's a behavior we don't want our children to do. But if we can see it first as there's got to be some kind of suffering mixed into this, there's got to be some reason that my child feels like the better thing to do is to hurt
Hmm.
themselves. That's suffering. So can we approach it maybe more empathetically then, with a sense of, how do I walk with someone who's suffering? There'll be time to get to what's the wrong beliefs and what's maybe the wrong behaviors that are going on. But I would say really viewing it as suffering can help you as a parent to move into it with a little bit more compassion and a little bit more grace, to
That's
start
really
out with.
good.
And I mean, I do think though that you will have to get to the heart, because right, that's what we want as parents. As parents, this is what we are called to, is to get at the heart. Because while what we want to do in these situations is kind of troubleshoot it.
Mm-hmm.
What's going on? What needs to change? What are the behaviors that we need to address? And in some ways you do need to do that. But I would say keep the heart as the target. And that kind of ties into what I just said about their suffering. There's some suffering attached to that. If they're not only if they're cutting themselves, there's some deep hurt in there.
Mm-hmm.
But I've heard some people say like maybe it's they're looking for attention. And while I don't think that's a very accurate reason why kids cut, if it is, think about what's happening. They are hurting themselves to get attention. So what attention is missing in their lives? And so I think just being able to, try to keep the heart as the target. And the way that we can do that well is by moving in first with comfort for the sufferer. And I'm thinking of 2 Corinthians 1, where it says, we are able to comfort with the comfort that we have received from Christ. And so I think that's a real key with parents is, can you move in with sympathetic care and comfort to your child?
I have a friend who's a counselor, and he said behavior should make you curious. And that's really stuck with me. We were talking about behavior and discipline and like, why are my kids doing this? And and he said, the first thing you should do is behavior should make you curious. And I'm thinking in this, if my child is cutting, that's a behavior that's very alarming. But if I get my child to stop cutting, but I don't know why they were cutting, then that's just going to manifest itself in some other kind of way. And so, I love that. Like, you want to be curious and understand there's some kind of suffering. There's some kind of thing in their life that is bigger than they can handle, where they are willing to take this step. And I think you're right. I think that'll go a long way, because you're probably not going to talk them out of it. You're certainly not going to lecture them out of it. And you're not going to typically, with your shocked and abhorred behavior, convince them to stop doing things. You're just going to convince them to be more secretive about their behavior.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think that's why I mentioned those 3 areas parents go wrong. So in light of that, how do you move in? You move in slow. I love that. You move in curious. Like I mentioned, there's a reason why this is going on. They might not know it. So asking them why is not necessarily going to be helpful, but just exploring with them what it's like before they do. That's what you really want to get to, is before they cut, what's going on? Because that's where we want to walk with our children well and care for them well.
Yeah, that goes back to habit loops, cue, trigger, reward.
Yes.
And so there's a cue that's happening in their life that is leading them on the pathway to where cutting and whatever dopamine release or whatever feeling or observing of the healing, that's the reward, cue behavior reward. So like, what is the cue? Because for us to really replace a behavior, and that's something, they might have to work through, is like, okay, when you feel these feelings, they are, okay, reality might not be these feelings, but you're feeling them and we got to walk through them. And our feelings are absolutely telling us how we're perceiving the world. Our feelings are not always accurate about what's happening in the world, but they're definitely accurate about how we're perceiving the world. So when you're feeling these things, when this event happens, this person happens, this time of day, this emotional feeling, you're going into this. And so what is the thing that triggers it? Because, it does seem like there's also going to have to be some kind of behavior replacement down the road, of like, okay, let's talk about healthy behaviors. But if you don't know what the cue is, you don't know what the feelings are, it's really hard to move in with healthy behaviors. And I agree, like, this is so easy to talk about when it's not like my actual child. in front of here. But also yeah, this is really good why there are actual real life counselors to talk to, because we are talking in a general sense, but we are not talking about your child in specifics, and everybody's situation is nuanced.
Such a good point, because one of the things that I would also tell parents is then you need to also get help, because your natural response is to try to stop this behavior, which we get it. Like anytime our children are potentially getting hurt, we're stepping in and saying, no, 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 this will get you hurt. Don't do that. And so that's going to be your natural response. So it's going to be important to talk to a counselor and have them help you know how to get to what's going on inside of them, because there's a lot that goes on in cutting. There is definitely that I've found a way of coping. It is a coping mechanism. It's a coping strategy. But there is also, and you touched on it, there is something that begins to happen with habit, the way that our brains have learned a certain amount of response, and there's a cycle that's going on there. So now not only do you have this emotional maybe coping mechanism, but you also now have a habit that has formed, and there are some behaviors that need to be changed. But you as a parent ultimately want to get to the place where your child has a better way of dealing with their emotions, and a counselor can kind of help you. If you don't know the questions to ask, talk to maybe a counselor or a more older, wiser parent who can kind of help you go through this and say, okay, what does it look like to not necessarily only focus on behavior, but focus on the heart and just her suffering or his suffering, and what it looks like to really incarnate Christ and be willing to comfort with the comfort that we have received in Christ. And I think that goes a long way, because, and I know this is somewhat, I don't want to proof text this, so I'll just set up the fact that I know I'm kind of using this somewhat out of context, but I think it's Ephesians 4:29 or 30, where it's talking about, because we are in Christ, all the things that we need to not do anymore. And one of them is to put away foolish talk. And that's good and true. But the second part of it, I think, can be applied to this setting, even though it's not talking about that. It says, but speak only such a word that is good for the need of the moment, that will give grace to the hearers. And so what is needed when your child is found out in this? Is it a lecture? Is it here's what you need to now do? Or is it a word that is fitting for this moment, that will encourage them and, in a sense, point them towards hope? And that's something we always want to do, is point them towards hope, because what they're dealing with is a world that is not working right for them. But Jesus is what makes the world work right, at least their world. And so helping them see that there is actually hope, and it's not found in one more time of scratching or biting or cutting or burning or all the different ways that kids do self-harm.
We are doing a youth series right now called Jesus Changes Everything. And for every topic that we're covering, we introduce the topic and we ask this question: how does the death and resurrection of Jesus change the way that I approach or address this topic, or that I experience this topic? And so I'd like to close out with that. How does the death and resurrection of Jesus change the way that we, whether it's the one who is cutting or the mom and dad who is trying to step in and help their child, how does the death and resurrection of Jesus change this whole dynamic?
Oh, that's such a good question. And what comes to my mind first and foremost is the reality that is so interesting, that as we're talking about cutting and self-injuring and wounding ourselves, the scripture actually says that by his wounds we're healed. And so in a really, I would say almost like a word picture for them, that all of these things that they carry that feel like too much for them are because they are too much for them. They are not designed to be their own savior, their own figure outer of their problems. They are designed to need a God who loves them, and a God who understands that they have weaknesses that end up taking them down paths and they make wrong decisions. But he has not only carried our burdens, but he actually covers those things that those wrong ways of coping and those wrong behavior patterns that we have. He covers them, and he covers them completely. And so I think even just that, seeing that picture of it's by his wounds we're healed is just a beautiful metaphor in light of the fact that they're trying to heal something with their own wounding that only Jesus can heal.
Man, that's beautiful. Eliza, thank you so much. This is really helpful. I did want to ask you, I think you had one other book that you were talking about, and you just got so much wisdom on a lot of categories. If you've produced it, I want people to know about it and have an opportunity to explore it. What was, before the machete talk began, what was the other thing that you were going to mention for us?
I think so. I mentioned the one on anxiety and the one on counting calm. I think the other one was the how to get the most out of your counseling. Is that what you were thinking?
Yeah. Well, you got that. I'm going to bait you on for another podcast with that one, but you have a book called How to Get the Most Out of Your Counseling. Man, I do. That feels like it should be standard issue for like being on Earth at this point, because the world is crazy right now, and we need help. So
well, and sometimes we just don't know what to expect, and we just kind of try to disarm a lot of those questions, and that's very, very short, very readable, kind of helps you get the most out of your counseling if you're going to take that route. So yeah,
thank you so much. You're always a delight.
You're
to
welcome.
have on.
My pleasure.
Appreciate it.
My pleasure.